Good morning, everyone. So I think we'll give everyone maybe 1 or 2 more minutes before we get started. But thank you for being here, and we appreciate your patience as we give everyone a little more time. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar. My name is John Conklin, associate with Institute for Child Success. I'm playing the technical support this morning. With us, we have Megan Caroline, Allison Elder, and Anna Walker. They'll introduce themselves shortly, but the only thing that I have before we get started is we will have a Q&A at the end. Please feel free to put questions in the chat box if you have them and just want to get them down so you don't have to remember them for an hour. Or if you have any questions technically related, I'm also happy to help if you send me a direct message. I'm the Institute for Child Success person in the chat box. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to our hosts for this morning's webinar.
Great, thanks, John. We'll go ahead and get started on the next slide. Good morning, everybody, and thank you again for being here. As John said, my name is Megan Caroline. I am the Director of Policy Research for the Institute for Child Success. I'll have Allison introduce herself and her organization a little bit more when we get to her remarks. But just to give a little bit of context, this webinar is the first time our two organizations are working together, which is very exciting. The Institute for Child Success is based in Greenville, and we are focused on improving child well-being from children prenatal to age 8. We got involved in the conversation around childhood homelessness about 2 years ago now. It started through a project with the Greenville County Community Care Collaborative in partnership with the Bradshaw Institute at Prisma Health. Childhood homelessness is a fascinating issue because children, of course, do not live by themselves. Children experiencing housing instability are experiencing it alongside the adults in their lives. There's often multiple factors coming into play. You can't talk about housing without talking about everything else that goes into a family's life, how it affects education, health, economic status. And in particular, we're thrilled to partner today for this conversation with Root and Rebound, because it became very clear with some of the community listening sessions we were doing that the child welfare systems and the criminal justice systems have really complex interplays with housing and the adults with whom children live. This is sort of the definition of a two-generational issue. And so what I'm going to do today, and you can see our goals of the session here, we're going to talk about the definition of homelessness. It is not clear-cut, and that's part of what complicates services and service provision. We're going to focus in particular on Greenville County. Excuse me. We'll talk a little bit about, from the national perspective, sort of circling down, a little bit too about how our current public health crisis is impacting housing instability, childhood homelessness in general. And then Allison will take us through some more nuance as to how exactly the criminal justice and child welfare systems exacerbate, cause, interplay. I mean, the cause and effect with this is very complicated. So we're delighted to have everybody here today. What we really discovered in these conversations is that folks who work in housing services, who place families, who work in shelters, they know a lot about this interplay, but it's those of us who might be providing services in another capacity for a family might not be able to see that whole picture, because so often we're just focusing on the immediate needs. And so really taking a systems level view today to how those issues impact families. So John, next slide. I'll also say, as many of you are probably familiar with, I'm currently juggling, childcare and a child at home, and my son is doing virtual preschool in the next room. So if my video disappears, you'll still see my slides, you'll still hear me. It's because his preschool session has gotten precedence on our Wi-Fi. We're hoping that won't happen, though. Next slide. So let's start with the national picture, the big picture here. And I see now that my labels on this graph got a little bit cut off. Essentially, what does homelessness look like at the U.S. level? We're going to talk about why this is such a complex question. But one of the best sources of information that we have about students is the U.S. Department of Education. States and districts have to be tracking that information about homelessness among students. That, of course, misses a lot of other people. It misses young children who aren't yet involved in the school system. They might be involved in other systems, childcare, Head Start, but those systems don't all feed into each other. And so when we say 1.3 million students in the U.S. were homeless nationally, we already know that's an undercount. It's also sometimes difficult to identify. School districts are trained in how to recognize this and the complex definition, but if a family doesn't want to identify as homeless, or if they're trying to keep their situation quiet, there's a lot of ways to do that. So 1.3 is for sure an undercount. As you can see here, when we look at the national picture, 74% of students who are homeless are living in shelters, and then are doubled up, and then 12% are in shelters. So first, let's talk about what doubled up means. Doubled up means a family living essentially with another family. Sometimes there's a question of, is this always a bad thing? Not always. Families who are living with grandma's moved in with them, might be doing so for some very important cultural reasons for them or health reasons for their family. But oftentimes when we talk about homelessness and doubling up, we're talking about a not great living situation. Not ideal, generally overcrowding. There could be some really complicated family dynamics there. If somebody is moving with their children back in with their parents, and their parents are hoping it's a short-term situation or not economically stable themselves to really be able to absorb the additional family members. It can often mean folks living in maybe a guest room, but maybe a living room, or retrofitting a basement to try to make it a better fit for living. There's often a lot of inconsistency with those living arrangements. You might not be sure exactly how long you'll be living with somebody. I go this deep on doubling up because oftentimes it can get overlooked in conversations because it doesn't seem so bad. It doesn't have the visual drama of a family living in a shelter or on the street or in their car. But in reality, we know that overcrowding can have some serious impacts on child learning and also health development. People might be returning to a family member who is coercive or with whom they have a difficult history to try to make this work. So it's not always the ideal scenario, even if there is safety involved. We absolutely expect that these numbers are going to be worse as the pandemic goes on. Even getting those counts has become more difficult with students not being in school. I think we've all seen at this point the students who have gone, they've sort of been dubbed missing. They're not tuned in for virtual learning, or they're not coming on for their virtual days. It's harder than ever to collect accurate data on what's happening with families, at the same time that it's more important than ever, essentially, to really know what families are facing. A couple of the things that you can hear through news reports and some data that's starting to come in, evictions, whether actual evictions or fear of evictions. There is still this federal eviction moratorium that we'll talk about a little bit more, but it's not a light switch. Folks don't necessarily know about it. They have to have a landlord who is abiding by it to some degree. If you have landlords who are working very under the table or in a legal apartment, there's a lot of complexities that go into that. Even beyond eviction, right away is the economic situations that families find themselves in. So the Census Bureau actually just released this week a new update to their Pulse data, which is a survey they've been doing throughout the pandemic of households in America. Nationwide, 46% of families with children who rent fear that they may be forced to move in the next 2 months because of eviction or fear of eviction. The number's a little bit lower in South Carolina, but it's still 39% of families with children have this concern that within 2 months they're going to be forced to relocate from their apartment. The numbers are slightly better for families who own, partly because foreclosure is a longer process and there's a little more economic stability built in, but it's still close to 1 in 5 families with children who own are concerned that they're going to have to move because of foreclosure in the near future. So not only do we have the current situation of homelessness, we have this real instability that families are just not sure what's going to happen in the near future and how COVID is going to exacerbate that moving forward. John, next slide. So in South Carolina, just to sort of give a real quick picture here, and this is looking at homelessness in general, not just childhood homelessness. Homelessness follows trends in population. You can see that the state's most populous counties, Richland, Horry, and Greenville, have the largest share of the homeless population as well. That can often make us think of it as an urban issue. I think that the visual of urban poverty is somewhat easier for us to conjure. We've seen it in movies and on news shows. But of course, even when we're just talking about Greenville, the county of Greenville is not all the city of Greenville. You know, the situation of what that might look like with a homelessness encampment within Greenville is very different than what it could look like in some of the farther flung parts of the county. The challenges are different as well. You sort of need a critical mass of folks in need to even justify the resources of a homeless shelter. Transportation issues become more difficult as you get farther away from urban centers, and so how are people even able to access the services that might exist for them, and are they even aware of those services? So while it might sort of be the first thing that comes to mind is urban housing, you know, and an encampment, in reality, especially throughout South Carolina with the geography of the state, it's a very different picture on the ground. Next slide. So this is looking specifically now at Greenville County. So we've sort of been zooming in a little bit here. When asked about the sleeping location of homeless students, what we see is that, you know, this is South Carolina on the left bar graph, and then Greenville on the right. 76% of students are doubled up. So again, this is pretty consistent with what we saw at the national level. That was 74%. But interestingly, in South Carolina in general, and in Greenville, you have a much higher percentage of families who are living in hotel motels. So essentially at the national level, that motel and shelter figure were flipped. Shelters were sort of the next most common living arrangement. This might not surprise many of you because there was major media coverage about, 2 or 3 years ago regarding the hotel crisis in Greenville with the closure of several low-cost motels for safety reasons. Families were very suddenly displaced. And so this was a visual story in Greenville County that folks were aware. Families are living in hotels and motels. Again, this tends to not get as much urgent attention as does the situation of shelter or street homelessness. You see here in Greenville, only 1% of the students are unsheltered or living in places not meant for human habitation, which includes cars, for example, which is good. We don't want to see that number higher, but that can become the visual that we've all sort of had through media coverage. In reality, hotels and motels, especially for families with more than one child, they are absolutely not meant to be a long-term living situation. The internet is untenable, which has been a real challenge with distance learning over the last 18 months. Access to food, access to anything in general. The motels that families are able to afford are usually along highways and not exactly walkable to the grocery store or, your kid's school or, soccer practice. So the trade-offs that families have to make for that becomes difficult. And in the long term, we also know that hotels and motels are not financially viable. They're a good short-term solution for some folks because they don't require the down payment that an apartment would. But over the period of a month, the money that they're spending, could really be going into an apartment if there was fewer barriers to being able to rent. And just again, for some perspective here, Greenville has almost 10% of the state's entire student homelessness population. So again, where we're seeing population centers, we see higher rates of homelessness. John, next slide. And really just want to touch on here, value percent is not super helpful there. So this bar graph should say 58% for that bottom tier, which is elementary school students, and then it's 21 and 21 for middle and high school students. I think this is really important for folks to understand. When we talk about childhood homelessness, this is Greenville County in particular, but talking about it even at the national level, we are generally talking about young students. There's a couple reasons for this. Family poverty is across the board higher when you have younger children, especially under the age of 5. Parents themselves are often younger, which could mean, the beginning of their careers or the beginning of their prime earning years, don't have savings to rely on. So sort of at a different point in life than where parents are by the time the child's in high school. The volatility that sort of goes along with that, the cost of childcare itself. And so I think it's really important to know that more than half of the homeless students in the district are young children. that might not be the picture that we all have in our mind. There's a really important data issue here as well. I can't tell you how many children younger than elementary school age are homeless in Greenville, in South Carolina, or in the nation. This is just where data systems don't play well together. The Head Start program serves a lot of children who are homeless, but their data, and they collect great data on it and provide support services, their data doesn't feed into the same public school system. That's not just a Greenville issue, that's everywhere. Families who are using private childcare, even if they have a voucher, again, the state might collect that data, but there's no one clearinghouse where that information is coming into. So other researchers have found that actually the first year of life is when a child is most likely to live in shelter, more so than any other year of their life. And that's because of some of the volatility that comes as a result of pregnancy. You can think of a situation in which somebody becomes pregnant and they were in a relationship where that was not the plan or not the goal. They might have a partner who leaves and withdraws financial support. They might have a partner who becomes abusive. We know that domestic violence increases during pregnancy. They might have a family who is unsupportive and essentially kicks them out. This goes for very young mothers, but it's not exclusively, the issue of young mothers. And then the sudden economic toll that some folks face as a result. And so the idea that infancy is the most vulnerable time for housing is stirring. And what we know about child development is that in particular, those first 3 years of life are the period of greatest brain development. The neurons are just firing at this incredible pace that they never capture again. And so while not wanting to, put pressure on any families who are experiencing this, it's a really important policy issue for us to think about, where children are living in that first year of life, even if they won't remember it by the time they're 3, 4, and 5, has a huge impact on the development that they're getting. We know that a lot of times shelters and housing providers are doing the best that they can, but they're not experts with child development. There are some programs, some home visiting programs that specifically look for unhoused families to work with them, but then there's challenges with that as well in terms of the instability. This is another place where COVID is taking a very real toll on things. If you're in an unstable housing situation with a new baby, going into group-based care, like a shelter, might be the furthest thing from your mind right now because the health risks just feel so acute. And so folks might be staying in housing situations that they would prefer to leave, that aren't particularly supportive. We could be talking about more doubling up. It's sort of an invisible issue in a lot of ways because we don't have the data to really put the whole picture together here. John, go to the next slide and I'll talk some more about why the data is so difficult, which is something I could do an entire discussion on. But after this, I'm going to hand it over to Allison to talk about really the complex legal issues that we get into here. But one of the reasons that I just ran us through 4 different data sources in that short period of time is because there's different definitions for homelessness. And I don't just mean that in a very semantic way. I mean that in terms of the actual federal departments that help provide some stability to families and count these figures all have different definitions. That might sound absurd on face, but in reality, it's because they choose definitions that are really targeted towards the goals that they have. And so the U.S. Department of Education, through the McKinney-Vento Act, and this is what Greenville has to use when they count their data, it's what all districts have to use. They define homeless children as any individuals who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. They specifically do include doubling up or living in a motel, acknowledging that those are situations that create instability, which has an impact on child learning. So again, you can see that line from the definition they use to their mission. For HHS, it's slightly different. They're not as focused on doubled up housing. They just focus on folks who lack housing. And then for HUD, they are really concerned about essentially how to get people into housing. How many units are we talking about? How many people are we talking about? And so doubled up is not included at all here because those folks are sheltered to a degree. They have these 4 categories of sort of different levels of severity. The category of literally homeless. Many of you might have heard about the point in time counts that all communities pick a night. There's this night in the winter where they go out and literally count on the street how many people are sleeping on the street, and then sort of combine that with the numbers that got reported from shelters on that night as well. that's an incredibly important category to talk about, right? The health needs, the risks of living on the street. You're at much greater risk of being the victim of crime, especially if you're a woman living on the streets, is very different than what the Department of Education is trying to capture in their figures. And so this is a world where there's no one right answer. We have to really consider all of these different data options, but you can see where it creates this real difficulty in having a comprehensive, cohesive conversation. If you say to me how many children are homeless in Greenville right now, I can't give you one answer, but I can give you four. And there's a lot of different reasons why that happens and what services would actually be important there based on what their situation is. So at this point, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Allison to talk a little bit about the interplay with other systems that exist out there as well, and really sort of how these all hit together.
Thank you so much, Megan. I'm Allison Elder. I am an attorney and Equal Justice Works Fellow sponsored by the Leonard and Robert Weintraub Family Foundation. I work with Root and Rebound. We are a nonprofit legal organization with offices in California and luckily an office here in South Carolina. We provide reentry legal services to folks who are criminal system impacted, meaning that they have a criminal record or have been incarcerated. And my project specifically focuses on family reunification. So I'm going to provide a broad overview today of the ways in which housing, child welfare, and the criminal justice systems interact. Next slide, please. There are at least 4 dimensions of housing instability to highlight. The first is really temporal stability. So, when is the family going to have to leave the housing, and are they going to have to frequently move? Second would be quality. Is there lead in the apartment? Things that can cause physical health concerns. Affordability. This is a big issue for our clients, access to affordable housing, particularly for folks who are also struggling with stable employment. And finally, inadequacy. Does the home have space for everybody? Does it have adequate facilities? Next slide, please. And many of our clients, unfortunately, find themselves in what I would call a tornado effect. There is no one entry point, and everyone's story is unique, but we see very commonly that folks are criminal system involved, experiencing housing instability, and have an open DSS case or have been DSS involved with their children. DSS stands for Department of Social Services here in South Carolina. So for example, if somebody is experiencing homelessness, they're much more likely to interact with law enforcement. If they have a criminal record, it's very likely that, and they have children, it's very likely that DSS also became involved when perhaps one of the parents was arrested. And being stuck in this whirlwind absolutely creates parental stress and also importantly has negative outcomes for children. Next slide, please. I'm going to go through 3 scenarios, hopefully to provoke some thought about the ways in which housing instability interacts with these other systems and how we might view families that are experiencing such instability. So assume that you are an advocate and a family is asking you for assistance with housing, but they don't have access to their vital documents. You feel like you want to refer them to DSS for assistance, but they're hesitant and you're also concerned about maintaining their trust. In this situation, you might already be aware that DSS has a policy that housing instability alone is not a reason to remove the child from the home. But what you might not be aware of is other things going on in the home. It is very hard to know what could or could not lead to an indication for child abuse or neglect. The family may have prior negative experiences working with DSS. They may have prior DSS involvement that could complicate a report to DSS. And they may know people in their community that have sort of been separated from their children through DSS involvement. Our stance would be it's appropriate to refer them to another social service provider and trust their experience and wisdom on what they are and are not comfortable with. And as we'll see in other later slides, once DSS is involved, it can be very difficult to disentangle the family from such involvement. Next slide, please. So here's a scenario about criminalization of poverty. So the police are called to a local motel and they discover a family that is living there long term. And this maps onto what Megan was saying about how so many people in Greenville are living in motels and hotels. So the adults have been having a dispute, and that's why the police are called there. But then they happen to see that there are knives within easy reach of the toddler. And they're concerned about potential danger to the toddler. Their initial response might be to involve DSS. But again, that can create a long-term engagement with the family. And it can also set the clock ticking such that the family who is already living in a hotel and needs stable housing might end up having to find stable housing really quickly to be able to successfully comply with DSS. And you're going to learn more about that as we continue through the slides. But I want you to keep that sort of setting the clock ticking regarding stable housing in your mind. And we would hope that law enforcement might wonder, is this really a family putting a child at risk, or perhaps they don't have space to store the knives in this living arrangement? Maybe they have recently moved motel rooms and they're still unpacking. And this would be an appropriate referral to a service provider like Homes for Hope that could assist the family in getting back on their feet without creating further system involvement. Next slide, please. In this third scenario, we're going to touch on something that is near and dear to Root and Rebound's heart, which is the absolute difficulty that our clients face with criminal records in accessing affordable housing. So a father has served his time in the state's criminal justice system and is released, and the family wants to reunite under one roof. But the children and mother are living in subsidized housing. And if he moves into the housing, it would jeopardize their living arrangement because of his criminal record. So they face a choice of trying to live under one roof, even though they're not supposed to, or possibly choosing to live separately, which would obviously be harmful to the child that wants to be with the parent and also would be more expensive. I think a lot of times people think of reentry related issues as impacting the adults that were incarcerated, but we know that when people are incarcerated, their families are absolutely impacted. And an estimated 7% of all US children have had a parent incarcerated at some point in their lives, 7%. And that parent most likely has a criminal record. And I would say in terms of parents with criminal records, that number would be even higher. So if you are working with a client and they disclose that they do have a criminal record and it's making it difficult for them to find housing, please reach out to us or give them our contact information. We would be more than happy to evaluate their record for any expungement, try to clean their record and explain to them the ways in which their record can and cannot prevent them from housing. Next slide. I do want to give you a little quick rundown. I imagine many folks are familiar with Section 8. If you're not, it is the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And it's really important for our lower income families and clients that we work with because it allows them to get housing that they would otherwise not be able to afford. But there are criminal records complications with getting a Section 8 voucher. You're automatically barred from Section 8 housing if you have to register as a sex offender or if you have a conviction for manufacturing meth in public housing. However, other criminal history can also be considered. And if you are working with a client that has a criminal record and has questions about getting a Section 8 voucher, that's a great referral for us. We'd be happy to speak with that individual. Additionally, once somebody is in Section 8 housing, if they become criminal system involved, that can complicate their housing voucher. This is an example from a South Carolina housing authority, but we would recommend that folks look at the county housing authority website where they are living. But I think it's a good general example of some rules that are placed on people that are in the Section 8 program. So they cannot commit fraud, bribery, or corrupt or criminal acts in connection with the program. And much more broadly, engage in drug-related or violent criminal activity or any other criminal activity that threatens the health, safety, or right to peaceful enjoyment of other residents and people living in the vicinity of the premises. So that's quite broad. And this is where I think we'd like to help you spot legal issues for your clients so you know when to advise them. You're going to need some legal advice, and it's important to I think to help people realize that, you know, if they're in Section 8 housing and they are arrested or something happens, it's a great moment to go ahead and reach out to, you know, our organization or another lawyer, another legal organization. And arrest should not be enough necessarily. So again, if they're just arrested for something, let's get some legal advice, but the arrest alone should not be grounds to kick them out of their housing. And more broadly, for, you know, especially for people that are unable to access Section 8, or maybe they're on the wait list for Section 8, they're trying to get into affordable housing. Private landlords also can have policies regarding criminal records, as many of you likely know. They're not allowed to have a blanket ban on people with criminal records because that violates the Fair Housing Act. And they can't preclude people from housing solely based on prior arrests. That also violates the Fair Housing Act. But landlords can craft policies that exclude people with certain convictions. There's a catch. Even a neutral policy might violate the Fair Housing Act if it has a disparate impact on a protected class. So that would be like race or sex. And because we know that the criminal justice system absolutely disparately impacts Black and brown people, using criminal records against people as a neutral policy can certainly have such a disparate impact. So if you run into somebody who feels like they are being discriminated against in their housing by a landlord, or they're consistently being precluded from housing because of their criminal record, that'd be, again, an appropriate referral to us or to another legal organization. Next slide, please. And I want to circle back to the child welfare involvement as well and give you, I think sometimes it can sound so abstract. So I wanted to give a couple of concrete case examples. I will note, I feel like I have to say as a lawyer, these are unpublished cases. That means that they're not precedent. So a later case, a later South Carolina court isn't going to rely on these cases, but they're emblematic of the ways in which stable housing comes up in family law cases. Specifically, these are termination of parental rights cases, which is what it sounds like it is. It's an action to end somebody's parental rights and free the child for adoption by another adult. So in this case, Jordan, the father was living with his girlfriend in a one-bedroom apartment, but he actually wasn't supposed to be in the house. It was Section 8 housing. I believe, if I recall correctly, he had a criminal record that would have precluded him from being in Section 8 housing. And DSS at that time became involved through a report on the mother. So at first, the children were able to be with the father, but DSS found out that the father was not actually supposed to be in the home and placed the children in foster care. Then a termination of parental rights action proceeded against the father. Now, when DSS gets involved with a family, if there's an indication, they will give a placement plan to the family, which is essentially a list of things that the parents are supposed to do to comply with DSS and resolve the situations that cause the family to be DSS involved so that the family can reunite and the children can be with the parents. We usually see stable housing as a requirement in placement plans. Okay, so if you remember back to DSS's policy, which is that children cannot be removed from the home simply because the family is not in stable housing. However, once DSS is involved and the children have been removed from the home, stable housing very well can be a requirement for the children to reunite with the parents. Okay. So in this case, Jordan was lucky, and the placement plan, for whatever reason, did not actually specifically list stable housing. So his failure to secure stable housing could not be a ground for the termination of parental rights action. However, the court still found that the children were harmed by the father's failure to provide them with a home in August 2016. Again, there was a home, but he wasn't supposed to be in it, and the court found that harmed the children. The father did find suitable housing by the time of the TPR hearing, and that meant that there was not clear and convincing evidence that his home could not be made safe within 12 months. Wow, that sounds, I know, convoluted. But again, I want to emphasize the ticking clock because it's part of why we hope that people will seek legal advice, legal counsel as soon as possible when they are in these situations. If you are working with a family that's seeking stable housing and has an ongoing DSS action, I hope that this sort of kind of lights the fire that stable housing is going to be particularly important for that family and they need to be in suitable housing as quickly as possible. Next slide. In this case, McDade also ties into the criminal records piece. The father had been incarcerated and was placed on the sex offender registry. His placement plan, like most that we see, did specifically list stable housing, and he was unable to obtain housing prior to 6 weeks before the TPR hearing. So he did get stable housing 6 weeks before the TPR hearing, but the court still found that showed he failed to comply with the placement plan. Okay, so he did not get secure stable housing in time. And the court held that termination of his parental rights was in the child's best interest, in part because even though the father was visiting the child and bonding with the child, it was unlikely father could provide a suitable home for the child. So again, stable housing in DSS cases, stable housing in family law cases is a really critical issue. It is difficult because it often puts us in a position where we're working with clients to try to get into affordable housing that really, might not exist, or they might not have access to because of their criminal records. But we would be happy to do an intake with any clients that you have that are in these kinds of situations. Next slide. And finally, I wanted to end on maybe a little bit more of a hopeful note with some housing updates. So the first, and this is not a presentation on the Fair Housing Act, and that could be probably a 5-hour presentation on some other date. But I wanted to flag that in 2020, HUD had passed a rule that really tightened the disparate impact standard in Fair Housing Act cases. The effect of that is making it a lot harder to bring discrimination cases under the Fair Housing Act. Okay, so what people have to plead, so what they have to, the plaintiff would have to put in their complaint, is really onerous right now. And there's this whole burden shifting. Without getting into all of it, it makes it really, really difficult for the person who is saying that they were discriminated against to succeed and bring the case in court. But recently, President Biden issued an executive order asking HUD to take a look at the effect of that rule. And we are hopeful that there will be a reversal or some lessening of this tougher disparate impact standard. And the second thing, which Megan mentioned earlier as well, is the eviction moratorium was extended until March 31st of this year. It's not a complete relief by any means. A few things to note about it. It doesn't apply to every kind of eviction. It's really about people that can't afford to pay their rent. So evictions based on criminal activity, for example, are not included under this moratorium. It's not automatic. If you are working with clients who have questions about how to go about invoking the moratorium, I would recommend, if they have a criminal record or a system involved in that way, they can reach out to us. If not, South Carolina Legal Services, which has offices all over the state, is another great evictions resource. But they would need to fill out a declaration and provide it to their landlord. And depending on their particular situation, there might be other steps that they need to take. For example, if there's already an eviction in process. And the other caveat is that they will owe back rent. So it's not forgiving the rent that they were unable to pay, unfortunately. That is going to have to be paid. And understandably, you may be working with people that feel like it's just delaying the inevitable and that they are going to be evicted when the moratorium ends. If you're working with people that are in that situation and they're behind on their rent, I have this little flyer I'm going to try to show you. There is a funded rent and mortgage assistance program in South Carolina. It is called SC Stay, COVID-19 Housing Assistance. Would highly recommend that you share that information with anyone you're working with who you think might be behind on their rent or mortgage. And there is some assistance available. So that for them, maybe, invoking the moratorium, but also getting this assistance to help pay back what they were unable to pay because of COVID could really benefit them. And I do want to put in a little plug. If during the course of this presentation, anybody came to mind and you thought, oh, this person, I think they would really need to speak with Root and Rebound. We are having a clinic tomorrow, with Thursday the 25th and Friday the 26th. Because of the pandemic, we are doing intakes over the phone. So it's a virtual clinic, it's not in person. And we would be happy to schedule an appointment with any of your clients. And our contact information is on the last slide. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have anybody in mind. And with that, I think we have our contact information on this last slide. Anna, were there any questions?
We did not have any questions in the chat, but if anybody has any questions, we are more than happy to answer them at this time. And again, there's our contact information. Please feel free to reach out by email or phone, and we will be happy to do what we can.
And this is Megan, and I will also just add, I'm going to pop into the chat box for folks right now some of the references that we discussed, just so that you have them to just, pull up. So we're going to pop in there the SC State program that Allison referenced, the link for South Carolina Legal, Root and Rebound's website, where you can just sort of go and learn more about their work and the legal clinic. I'm also going to put in here, though I think many of us are familiar with it right now, but using the United Way's 211 hotline, if you don't know where to start with a housing issue that somebody is facing, or you realize that there's just so much going on, that's sort of a great resource to start with for triage and figuring things out from there. So I'm just going to pop those in right now. I will also say, because I'm taking a look at the participants, and I think we have a pretty good mix of folks who are interested in the on-the-ground services and the sort of more research and advocacy piece of things. So ICS also recently released a paper specifically about childhood homelessness and sort of the complex health and education impacts as well. So if that's something that you're interested in learning more about, that's on our website as well. And we do have some questions coming in now. I'm happy to read them since I'm in the chat box. So first question we have is there any effort to work with legislation to resolve eviction forgiveness? What is another barrier for applicants?
So that is interesting. So regarding evictions, especially here in South Carolina, people will, clients specifically will say that, hey, I have an eviction on my record. How do I get that taken off? So this is kind of a complicated answer. In South Carolina, we have something called the Public Index, which is each county has their own public index, and it's maintained by the court system. They monitor civil cases and criminal matters, and in those databases, if they have an eviction filed against them, it will be there. And if that eviction is processed, if it goes through and an eviction is ordered, it will be marked as an eviction. However, if they move out ahead of time, something else like that, they're able to work it out with the landlord, it doesn't go to a final disposition in court, they will mark it as settled, which is obviously the preference because that's technically not an eviction. So when a client says, hey, I need to remove an eviction from my record, unfortunately, there's no way to remove it. So that record is technically the court's record that is public to individuals regarding evictions. I will say that I am not currently aware of a pending effort regarding legislation. However, we are partnered with a number of other organizations. This is a very, very, very common issue and a huge barrier to people. And South Carolina Legal Services is amazing with evictions. They know them inside and out. Regarding, very little loopholes. You have to have this text in bold, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you have a client that has an eviction matter that is not related to their criminal involvement, it's for non-payment, it's for various things, please refer them to South Carolina Legal Services because they are absolutely the experts on that subject. However, if it involves their criminal record, please feel free to reach out to us. That being said, I do know that this is an issue that has been brought to the attention of South Carolina Legal Services. There is a very well-versed housing attorney at South Carolina Appleseed that is also aware of this issue. And so we are certainly planning on, with other various reform efforts, collaborating and trying to figure out the best way to address this and find a real solution to it, because it is a problem for an unbelievable amount of the population and is really unfortunate.
I'm going to pop into the chat also, Anna, because you just referenced South Carolina Appleseed. I'll pop in their web address as well for folks who are building up their rolodex today. Do people still have a rolodex? In particular, too, something that I was thinking about before we get into another question. We have a question in here that says, have you seen a change in general DSS and social services posture towards housing issues in the last year or so as they try to shift towards an increased priority towards child well-being and family preservation? And I think that probably everybody has different perspectives on this question. I will say, personally, I hear more folks speaking that language, though whether that translates into action on the ground, I think is, potentially a different story. I think one thing that's incredibly important when we talk about DSS and their posture is a statement, a policy is not nearly enough to make the change that's needed here. And so when we were working on our childhood homelessness project through the Greenville County Community Care Collaborative, we, by which I mean John, who's actually running our webinar today, ran 3 listening sessions. This was in person back when we could still do things like that. And we picked 3, different areas of the county that all had sort of different demographics, different housing issues that we could identify through administrative data, whether that was a very high rent to income ratio, high housing instability. In the northwestern part of the county, the issue isn't necessarily about rent, but it's about families who have owned their homes for a very, very long time, and the conditions are starting to perhaps become unsafe, and there's concern about, whether it's still going to be habitable. All it takes is one case, like the ones that Allison walked through, to make people very untrusting of the idea that, lack of housing is not itself a reason for removal. All it takes is one case where somebody saw the difficulties of, reunification because of housing to create this real climate of fear within a community. People won't go for housing assistance. They don't want to talk about their issues because they're concerned once the state gets involved. What happens if you go and try to get, some financial support to fix the dangerous conditions of your home, and the state says, well, this is just too dangerous. Your children can't live here. And so it just takes one story in a community, and that becomes what people know, because the experiences of somebody that are just much more tangible to you than those who, the statistics. And so I say all of that just to say that, DSS policy is good, but the practice that we see at the individual caseworker level, many of whom are trying to do the best they can with very few resources, and really just the attitude that agencies in general bring to the conversation is so important to starting to shift that perception and really build a partnership dynamic. It's something that we talked about a lot in the strategic plan that we put together as part of that project, that there's no one agency that's involved in the housing issue, and so there's no one agency whose policies can change it. It has to be everybody on board.
I think we're also getting questions in this Q&A box. All
right.
Are there any plans to create a housing court in Greenville like was recently done in Charleston?
So I understand that we just recently started a homeless court. However, again, we have a number of partner organizations. Charleston, not so. South Carolina Legal Services has offices all over the state. I think about 7 or 8 offices in various regions. However, Charleston in particular has 2 other pro bono representation organizations. One is one is Charleston Pro Bono, and one is Charleston Legal Access. Is that right, Allison?
Yes.
I think so. One does sort of a sliding scale. So that kind of in-between population that is, doesn't fit within the income guidelines of legal services, but really can't fork out the money for an attorney. And the other organization kind of takes some of the overflow from South Carolina Legal Services. We certainly have more people in need than we do organizations that can serve, as much as we do try to cover the ground. That being said, I do know that they do a lot of housing in Charleston, and that I think her name is Nicole, and I'm going to pronounce her last name wrong, Paluzzi.
Paluzzi.
She is a housing guru, and this is something that is on her radar too. That I'm certainly going to partner and discuss about, hopefully starting in Greenville and other parts of the state.
We have another question in the chat box that is really interesting, and so I'm just going to read it in its entirety. I'm sorry, it's in the Q&A. I would love to know your opinion on action steps specifically for law enforcement. As a law enforcement wife, I know countless times that officers have paid rent or provided groceries for families in need in order to prevent DSS involvement for this exact reason. This is particularly pertinent for single moms. How do we get resources like these available to agencies, since they provide such a crucial touch point that can seriously impact families slipping into the cycle? This is a great question. And this is something that I think we have to talk about, because we can talk about policies and agencies, but at the very individual frontline worker level, there's a lot that can be done. In the example that Allison shared, you know, that's a real touch point. You know, that moment where the officers respond to the hotel room and see those knives. You know, if this was a movie, the frame would freeze and you'd see them trying to figure out, you know, what do I do next? Is this actual, you know, neglect? Is this child going to get hurt? Is this actively harmful, or is this a family who needs something to help strengthen the strengths they have and help to, you know, overcome some of those challenges? And so I think talking about this at the individual level is really, really helpful. One thing that I'm going to put into the chat, I think this is the most resource-packed chat box I've ever seen. You know, like I said, the United Way hotline is a really fabulous resource, but there's also this great guide, and I think I'm getting it from the Greenville Homeless Alliance website, which is also a fabulous organization to have bookmarked for the questions that you have. It's a document put together by United Ministries. It's called the 2020 Primary Resource List for Greenville. The way this list is divvied up, and this was it's dated October of last year, it sort of has a column for what different agencies can provide, what different organizations can provide. So financial assistance, food assistance, shelter, housing, et cetera. And includes some notes in there about, you know, this is intended for seniors, disabled adults, families with children. And so if you find yourself in a situation where you sort of, you know, want to be able to point people in the right way, this is a great guide to sort of help figure out what the next step might be, to help sort of prevent it from getting to that crisis point that we're trying to avoid. It's a funny looking link, but I swear it takes you right to a PDF. Okay, I'm trying to take a look back. We have one more minute. So I would just say in closing, if there's any questions that we didn't get to today or questions that are going to percolate, we want you to think about this presentation after you're done here today. Our contact information is here. In particular, you know, the clinic that Root and Rebound is going to be running. If you're working with folks who do have, you know, a criminal record issue, there's a lot more resources in Greenville. There's a lot of resources in Greenville County, and I think there's a lot more than even those of us who have looked into it realize. And so our contact information is here to reach out for more information, whether that's direct service or research. You know, at ICS, we sort of have a slide deck. If you're writing a grant application about housing challenges in Greenville, we have some data already pulled together that was part of our program to say, you know, we can send that to you and you can sort of build your grant application around that, because no one agency is going to be able to conquer these issues alone. So hopefully by having these conversations, we create more opportunities to collaborate together and sort of ease that burden. Great. So at this point then, John, I think we are fine to, oh, I'm sorry. Somebody said, can you display that sign? Oh, okay. I know Allison already put up the SC Stay logo, so we are good to go on that one. Okay, great. So reach out, folks, if you have any questions. Thank you so much for joining us today. We will make a recording of this available maybe next week. It depends on how long it takes to edit a little bit. But feel free then to share with colleagues who were unable to join us today, and to reach out for any questions and feedback.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much.